This video is an answer to a request by Jason to provide an overview of using dashboards in Excel. And this video will include adding and linking controls to our spreadsheet, how to then use index and if functions to link them to our model inputs, and then how to make a dashboard more aesthetic. I'll also touch on a couple of advanced topics that we don't need to know for this class, but may provide nice context. So the first thing we'll do is make sure we can get to the developer ribbon so we can insert form controls and see the different types of controls. Let's go to Excel. If you don't have developer on your menu, go to File, Options, Customize ribbon, and Developer. Then you can go to the Developer tab and insert things. First, let's walk through the model. I've built a simple mortgage payment model, and I've talked about what types of controls we would like to use to control which inputs, and I've typed in a few options that we can use. So all we need to do is create controls and link them. What the model does is gather some basic information from the user about a mortgage and calculates what the mortgage payment is going to be. So given a purchase price and a down payment, it can calculate a loan amount. And given the term, payments per year, whether or not we'll escrow insurance, and if so, how much the annual cost is, calculates the number of payments, and then given an interest rate, calculates the periodic interest rate so that it can calculate the actual loan payment to pay off the loan, and depending on what we said about insurance, may add a portion of that to the payment. Notice that one of the problems with this model is using this if statement to see if the escrow insurance is supposed to be, if the insurance is supposed to be escrowed. If yes, let's look at how this one works. So the way an if statement works is we have a logical test. Typically we check to see if something is equal to or greater than less than something else. And depending on the answer, we know what to do if the answer was true or if it was false. So if we say yes, escrow insurance, we get the $100. If we say no, don't, then we don't. The payment's the same as without the insurance. The problem is if we say why, the model's not smart enough to know that we meant yes. And so a checkbox is a good way to fix that. Let's insert a checkbox from the form controls, not from the ActiveX controls. And then let's link that checkbox to cell J3. I always like to 3D shade these controls. So if we click on it, it says true. If we unclick it, it says false. That's going to be really handy in this formula. So instead of saying if something equals something else, we can just go straight to this cell and it's either going to be true or false, which is what we want. So we'll click right there. And now when we click the checkbox, we get the $100. If we unclick it, we don't. So we can edit the text in the checkbox by just putting our cursor in there and say escrow Notice we no longer need these two cells, so we'll clear them out. And this linked cell is a very important cell, so let's color it yellow. And in fact, let's color yellow all the cells that are going to become linked cells to save time today. Next thing we'd like to do is add a spin button to control the annual interest rate. You get to a spin button on the forms controls by choosing spin button. And for now, let's put it right next to this number. Format it. And it has a cell length that can go to L3. Right now the spinner is set to range from 0 to 30,000, which is probably a bit high for interest rate. And we'll probably like to keep that somewhere at 20% or below. And it's going to change by 1. But watch what that means. It means that as I start clicking up on the spinner, it counts by whole numbers. We know that that's 4.0, that's 5.0, but this is 0.05, so we've got a problem, but it's easily fixed by simply saying equals that divided by 100. We'd like to have come in here and say count by 0.01, but Excel won't let us have anything smaller than a 1 in there. Now this is a little bit misleading because this is formatted as an input cell. Let's remove that so no one accidentally types a number in there and writes over our formula. This is something we'd like on our dashboard. Let's move it over here for now. Next, let's draw a scroll bar to control our purchase price. So we'll insert a scroll bar, and it doesn't care if it's vertical or horizontal. We'll draw it horizontal, and we'll link it to its linked cell. And since we'd like a purchase price in the range of 100,000, what I'd like to be able to do is say the maximum is maybe 300,000, and then have an incremental change of 10,000 and a page change of 100,000. But I get an error. Excel won't let me put anything greater than 30,000 in these boxes. So let me just back them off by 100 each. Go ahead and link them to this cell. And let's see what I get there. I'm counting by thousands up to 3. So let me multiply that by 100. Now I can choose the home price I desire within $10,000 or so and use the scroll bar to do it, and I get around that 30,000 limit on the control. Once again, we don't want people to think they can type a number in there because they'd be typing over our formula, so we need to format that as normal. So let's move these controls and cells over to our dashboard area. And next we'd like to do the list box to control the term in years. Go to Developer and insert Listbox. And the Listbox format control not only needs a cell link, but it also needs an input range. And this is the range. It's only 2 cells long. We could be much longer. but we'll use that as the input range. And now when we select one of those two items in our list box, it changes this cell to indicate which row in that range we've selected. So we need a formula to convert row to this actual number that we'd like to get in there. And one formula we can use is index. So if we point an index at that array and say which row number would we like out of that array, then that formula gives us the answer. And cut and paste that formula into term. Format that as normal. Now we have a control that will put the appropriate term in years into our model. The next one is a combo box to control payment frequency. So let's draw a combo box. Format it to link to this cell, and its input range is this range of cells. So that when we choose one of them, it tells us which number on this list we chose. And so we'll use a similar formula, index. This time we'll look at this array and choose this row. And so if I choose monthly, I'm going to get 12 payments per year. So I'm going to do the same thing. Cut that formula and paste it here. Format that as normal. And we have one more. It's option buttons to control the down payment. We want to limit the down payment options to 0, 5, or 20. Now with option buttons, we need multiples. So we'll draw one, and I'll copy and paste again. And I don't have to get them all lined up. I'll show you how to line them up right here. I can right click and hold down shift and click them all, but that gets really tricky. Another way to click them all would have been to go to home, find and select objects, and notice it turned my cursor to an arrow. I can click and drag to select them all. Either way you want to select them all is fine. Once you get them all selected, go to Format and Align. And look at all these options we have. Let's align left and watch how it aligns them to the left. And if one were out of order, let's say this one, it's in pretty good order from how we drew it, but let's say it were down here. Now let's try all this again. Find and select. Turn that to an arrow. Select them all. Format. Align. Align left. And this time they're not evenly spaced, so we want to align and distribute vertically. And now they're very nicely spaced. With option buttons, it's very important to put a group around them. If I had multiple sets of option buttons and I want Excel to only let me click one within each box, then I have to have a box around it. If I had 3 buttons here and 3 buttons over here and no boxes, if I click the top one here and try to click the bottom one here, it would unclick the top one. So we have to tell Excel what's the group of options that we want to allow here. And then we can edit the text on each of these individually. and link them to a cell. Note we only have to link one. When I choose the top one, it tells me I chose the first in my option button list, and the second, and the third. I wish there were a way to make these labels look at these labels, but there are not. Still, we need a formula that will choose one of the answers based on the linked cell. And of course, we'll copy that formula into our input cell and format it as normal. So we've replaced all but one of our inputs with a control. I think this is an input that's better handled without a control. So let's just move it over onto our dashboard. And let's move the rest of our model a little bit out of the way. Now that we have controls to handle all the inputs to our model, let's rearrange the dashboard area and make it a little more aesthetic. Now to get the shading done, let's choose a relatively large area around the outside of our dashboard. Color it gray. And then let's choose a more interior area. Color it blue. And then to get a 3D effect on that, let's go to borders, more borders, and choose a thick dark border on the upper and the left, and a thick white border on the right and the bottom. Now we get kind of a nice 3D effect there. And that's what I wanted to cover in controls and dashboards. Let's go back though to some of the advanced topics and talk about VBA. There was one item that we didn't use on the insert menu, and it was this button. Actually, there were two. One's a label, and we could have used that label up here to call this our mortgage payment calculator, but there's really no reason to use that label. It's even less customizable than just typing something into a cell. What I wanted to talk about is a button. So if we come up here to the very first one and insert a button somewhere on our dashboard or anywhere else on the spreadsheet, it thinks we want to run a macro, and it asks if we want to assign an existing macro. There are none. We could write a new one, or we could record one. So let's record a macro. And let's store it in this workbook. And notice when I hit OK, a square will pop up down here indicating that we're now recording a macro. So everything we do will get recorded in Visual Basic. And what we're going to do is go to Data, What If, Goal Seek, and we're going to set the payment equal to 1,000 by changing the purchase price. I don't want to change it over here because remember this is the input cell. And what this says is if I'm going to make annual payments for 15 years and they can't be any larger than 1,000, then I can only buy a $13,000 house. That's kind of silly because our payment limit would be based on the number we were making per year, but let's just roll with this. If we wanted to write a button that says set my payment to 1,000 and tell me how big of a house I can buy, this is how we'd do it. So we're finished recording that macro. Let's hit stop. And then let's go look at that macro. Basically, the important cells in the macro, the important lines, were just one. And what the macro tells us to do is when we click that button, go set range B20 equal to 1,000 by changing range L3. That's a pretty handy macro to have. So let's see what happens if I change that to semi-annual payments. How big of a house could I buy and limit my payment to 1,000? I could buy a $78,000 house. Quarterly payments, I could probably even buy a bigger house. Yeah, goal seek that to 1,000. Now we're up to $52,000 house. If I were willing to pay $1,000 per month, I could buy a $158,000 house based on these other assumptions. And we can, of course, change them as well. Let's edit the text on that. So obviously we're not learning Visual Basic yet, but wanted you to know what the button would be used for when we learn it later. So one important thing we need to do is remember that this 1200 is truly an input that we can type a number into, so we want to format it as such. And now I think we've pretty much completed the dashboard. We've got every different kind of control that we can use in form controls on there, including a button. And we've talked about how to link those to the yellow cells, and we've talked about different ways to use formulas to make use of the yellow cells. The easiest would be to just take the cell, divide it by 100 to get percent, or maybe multiply it by 100 or 1,000 to get a large number, so that we're not constrained by the ranges on the spin and the scroll bars. The checkbox, we talked about how the cell is actually going to be true or false, so we just need to say if that cell when we're doing our logical test. Show you that one more time. We just need to say the logical test is that cell itself is not equal to or greater than something else, so on and so forth. We talked about how the list box needs a range and returns which line on that range, and all of the options are available to see at one time. If there were more than we could see in that window, then we could use these buttons to scroll up and down. A combo box is exactly the same thing, but we can only see one row at a time. To see our other options, we have to click on this to choose. And those things should be intuitive from other software to use. They also use an input range and a linked cell and that index formula to decide which row of that input range we're referring to. And then finally, the option buttons. While the option buttons themselves don't link to this range, they do control the order in the same way. Their linked cell represents first, second, or third of the option buttons. And so we can still use our index cell to index which member of the range we got based on that number. And then finally, we did a button where we talked about how all that does is link a macro to the button. Certainly don't need to know that for exam 2, but hopefully we'll get into that in module 3. I think the last thing promised on the agenda was to say, why not use ActiveX controls? And let's go and look at that. So if we go back to that window where we saw our macro, this is called the Visual Basic Editor. And in addition to adding macros, remember our goal seek macro was added here, we could actually come into a workbook and we could insert something called a user form. We will never get into this in this class, but if you wanted to really start developing your own software, within your workbook you could insert this user form and you could put all kinds of things on it. And so you'd go to Toolbox and you can insert a lot of the similar things that we were doing on the spreadsheet, like a checkbox or some option buttons. But you can take it a step further and insert, make it a multi-page dialog box so that we could put some things on one page, a toggle button, maybe a spin button, and then on the next page you could put something else. But every single one of these things is going to be tied to a macro. So if I tried to link that to a cell, I don't have that option. It's going to give me the properties or maybe let me view some code where I could write some VBA code to control that. But we're not going to get into that in this class. These user forms can get pretty complicated. So I'm going to remove that. I don't want to export it. If we had come over here to developer and insert and chosen something off the ActiveX controls, we'd be looking at the same kind of functionality. We would not be able to link that to a cell anywhere, but it would have properties that we could assign through VBA and run macros from it. That's why we're never going to use ActiveX controls on a spreadsheet. Hope you found this video helpful. Thanks, Jason, for requesting it.